Actually, it was probably his name. I thought that helped. It was his name. Yeah.
Welcome everyone. We have unchained them for just an hour from their desks over in Baldwin Hall. And so we're going to have a discussion. Some familiar faces to some of you out there. Can you hear? This has an echo. I may eventually turn it off. But we have a distinguished panel today, and I'll introduce them in just a moment. Let me tell them again what you all have been doing for the past week and 2 days. And some of you actually came in yesterday on Memorial Holiday and worked. I saw 12 signatures on the makeshift log yesterday, so thank you for signing in. They have been hard at work, not only from 8:30 until noon, which is the requirement for them. We also offered that they could stay until 4:30, but this year they can stay 24 hours as long as they don't sleep there. That was the condition that Residence Life gave us. You cannot sleep there, but you can come in 24 hours and work if you'd like. So it's a different model this year. In the past, we've locked up around 5 o'clock and closed the building, but now you have 24-hour access. So we'll be getting some feedback on this whole process a little later from you in order to make plans for next year. They're also logging their hours and number of pages written and number of pages edited, revised, and so forth, just so we can see in the aggregate how this process is working for everyone. So let me introduce our panelists, and this is going to be an informal discussion. We are recording it for some of the campers who couldn't make it over, and we'll offer it for you for review if you'd like. We have with us Dr. Andy Doolin. I'll introduce them in order here. He is Associate Professor of English, and he's the Director of Graduate Studies in English. He has a new book coming out in July, is that right? Called Territories of Empire, and it's coming out by Oxford University Press. And we do have folks who have published by Oxford University Press, Cambridge University Press, and Johns Hopkins University Press here. One of the reasons I invited, or I encouraged these panelists to come, is that they do have sort of a robust, hearty writing life. So they can speak also from their perspective as daily writers and researchers. Dr. Doolin's earlier book, Fugitive Empire, Locating Early American Imperialism, came out in 2005. Beside him is Dr. Mark Peffley. He's a professor in political science, former co-editor of Political Behavior, and co-author of Justice in America, The Separate Realities of Blacks and Whites. And his book is out by Cambridge University Press. Beside him is Dr. Susan Odom. She's the newest member of the faculty here on the panel. She is in chemistry, assistant professor. She is author of numerous articles in places and venues such as Chemical Communication and Journal of American Chemical Society. She is a UK alum on the undergrad level from 2003, long before all this demolition and all these new norms started rising. And then beside her we have Dr. John Thielen, Professor of Educational Policy Studies and Evaluation, and he is author of, among other books, A History of American Higher Education, which is in its second edition by Johns Hopkins University Press, and most recently, The Rising Cost of Higher Education. That actually came out last year. I'm behind a little bit, right? It was last year. And you have a new book that is sort of a companion to your history on essential documents of higher education that came out just a few months ago. So please welcome our distinguished panelists here today. So I'm just going to ask them to start, I guess, just by sort of jumping off on a personal level, just telling us a little bit about their own dissertation experience. If they want to reflect back, maybe they repressed that some, but that's a starting place at least, and some common ground for you all to connect. What I'm hoping is that we're going to open some windows here into writers' lives, researchers' lives, and former dissertation writers, successful writers. Open that window just so you can get some insights into how they work and how they may provide some models for your own work ethic. So we'll start with Dr. Doolin.
Okay, well, thanks for inviting us, and I admire your commitment to your research, and I think this the boot camp is a really wonderful experience, and I believe in it so much that we started one in English for our grad students. It's probably the best thing you can do, I think, as a grad student. My experience as a dissertation writer is exactly the same as it is as a book writer. I pretty much have the same approach to my research. I have the same routine. I take a break sometimes at the same time. I know I have several students in the room, so they've heard some of this before. But let me just tell you that every successful writer I know has a very reliable and idiosyncratic sense of time. They don't allow many excuses. They don't allow things to shift their daily schedule unless maybe they have a spouse who's sick or a child that needs looking after. Pretty much everything gets cut, so it falls below that priority of getting your writing done. That's easier said than done. I've done a few of these sorts of panel presentations dating back to the time I wrote my dissertation. So I was in a public university where the grad students taught a lot. The demands on us were really, really stiff. It was hard to find writing time, and I was able to finish my dissertation on time. And part of that was because of sticking to my routine in the library cubicle, getting there every day, Memorial Day, no holidays except for when it was my holiday, right? When I couldn't take it anymore, I would go off and have a nice break. But basically creating your own calendar. And so at different points in the last 15 years, after the dissertation, I was invited back to give a talk about how to complete a dissertation. Right after my first book, I gave a talk on how to write a first book. And it's the exact same presentation every time. Right? I mean, the same thing applied to me when I was a grad student. So I think that would be my first, the fundamental element for me of writing is making sure that you guard your routine, closer than any other thing in your life other than your family. If your teaching gets in the way, this is my personal opinion, if your teaching gets in the way, it should be pushed down that priority scale. Right? Everything about your research and writing should take precedent. Grad students in English have a slight advantage. I'm biased in this, but they know a lot about the writing process. They know what it's like to revise over and over. Sometimes, of course, that can be a very difficult process, and it can keep you sort of on that wheel, trying to push it uphill. But my wife's a scientist, and we were talking last night, and I was asking her about some of the differences with people writing dissertation in the sciences. And it was my assumption that perhaps people in the sciences, because they worked in labs and they collaborated more with their professors, that they would be mentored more directly by the professors. And she, I see people shaking their heads, right? She said, no, that's not the case. So I think the other thing that has been important along the way is trying to learn about my writing process, trying to get comfortable with the fact that I would have to write multiple drafts to get at a finished product. And that is something that is only done by essentially staying married to your routine, as mind-numbing as that may sound to some people. The second thing is, what I realized in retrospect is that grad students generally are not taught how to be writers. And that goes for any discipline. We're taught how to be good students, We go into seminars, we impress our professors, they want to work with you, you know, that sort of thing. But no one really takes you aside and tries to teach you how then to flip that switch and become a dissertator, right, to write a book. And that to me is one of the blind spots of graduate education in almost every field. So what boot camps do is essentially they try to immerse you in what that routine feels like, right? It tries to get you used to doing that. And so I would say that one challenge for every grad student that you can work out in a boot camp is trying to get accustomed to writing 6 days a week, if you can, and developing that routine. Because writers are not born, right? They are made. You know, I'm not, you know, clearly was not an academic superstar in high school and college, right? It's all about, do you have a passion for your work, and can you stay married to your routine, right? You don't have to be the genius on the block, right? And so I think that for me is the key, is trying as hard as you can to make the switch from student to researcher / writer. Very difficult to do, but I think participating in the boot camp is the way to do it.
Okay. You know, when I don't want to tell you what the process was like of writing my dissertation. Suffice it to say, you know, a lot of people describe their dissertation as a labor of love. Mine was more like an exorcism. You know, and it took way too long. And I learned how to write on schedule, but I always, like an alcoholic who has to go back to AA meetings. And the best thing I've ever read on how to write a lot is a book. It's real thin. Sometimes you can find it on the web, but you can order it for $10 or less. It's by Paul Silva, a psychologist who has a book called How to Write a Lot. And what he does throughout the book is tackle a lot of myths about writing and how to write a lot. And the way we kind of deceive ourselves with all kinds of psychological issues that we have to deal with before we can really, you know, turn on full steam and write a lot under a deadline or write a lot by inspiration. Well, all those things are kind of myths, and he shows how a lot of research shows they're unfounded and spacious. And one of the first things that he points out is, you know, it may be different for someone in creative writing or English, but for most of us, we're doing a lot of research writing. I teach a course in research writing in my department. And what everyone finds out is that, and if they admit it, writing is hard. And it's not fun. It's non-fun activity for, you know, probably 90% of us. Even if we write well by standards within our discipline, it's difficult. The fun part, I guess by comparison, is to do the research, plan a project, you know, collect the data, and do the analysis. But then when it comes to taking all that and squeezing it into a chapter or an article that's going to be presented to either your advisor, your dissertation committee, or you're going to send it out for publication, that's hard. That's hard. And, you know, you have to use a lot of discipline. And the way Paul Silva says you write a lot is by, you know, doing exactly what you've already heard. You've got a free time in your schedule, regular schedule, and commit yourself to it. And if you're writing, the next two big myths are you wait for a big block of time. You know, I'm going to wait for a big block of time, and then I'm going to write like hell. I'm going to write like crazy and get it all done because I'm going to do it on deadline. And then the other big myth is I'm going to wait for inspiration. Now, the inspirational myth is the worst because those people never write, and they might have projects that are collecting dust, you know, data they've collected and never written up. but they rarely get inspired. Or if they get inspired, it's not long enough to take it to completion. And the only people, in terms of pages written, projects completed, that actually write are people who write either every day or 3 times a week for 3 or 4 hours, and they have goals. Because the other thing is, as we've already heard, is that even though we all know how to do it, it's bringing ourselves to actually do it that is the problem. And in my field, no one can glorify their writing by saying, I've got writer's block. Writer's block is for people in creative writing, I suppose, you know, who are going to really move people to tears. That's not going to happen in my field by talking about, you know, regression analysis or analysis of variance. It's a matter of discipline, enjoying what you're doing, and working at it regularly. Because if you keep a log or you know, you work at it every day, you're thinking about it. Even if you're sleeping, you know, you're working on it. And the next day, even if you're having a bad day at writing one day, the next day, if you keep at it, you're working on it, and you know, things develop. So the thing is to just be consistent and keep at it and just do it. That's my kind of Alcoholics Anonymous, you know, advice to you. Go ahead.
When I hear people talking about the strategies of writing, I think more about what did I struggle and what were my major barriers to really getting started with a significant effort in writing my thesis. And I think I started in around December of my 4th year and planned on being done in May of the next year. And I ended up finishing in September, which was not so bad. But it was mostly a matter of identifying what was going to go into the thesis, because you don't have to put everything you did into your thesis, no matter what your field is. And I mean, I probably could have doubled my thesis with data if I wanted to, but it's not necessary to tell a story. And I think it's important, both when you're writing communications and journal articles, or when you're writing a thesis, to think, what is the minimum publishable unit? And what is the least amount of data I can put into this work to tell the story that you need to tell? And if you can identify the story that each chapter tells and how many stories you want to tell that relate to one another, I think that was the biggest barrier in overcoming what the content of the thesis was going to be. So if you think about this minimum publishable unit in everything that you write, that's I think about that every time I write something.
Yeah.
And when you're dealing with data and organizing what's going to go into a thesis, I remember what I found most helpful after sorting through all these different drafts of multiple chapters connected into each other, and there's 50, 100, 150 pages at a time, wondering what is going to go into this thesis. And then I took a vacation with a group of friends in the mountains of North Georgia, and while everyone was horseback riding and trail hiking, I was working on my computer, and it was so relaxing because there was an internet, and well, there was a TV, but I didn't turn it on, and no one was around. And I think it's kind of like your boot camp in that you've got a focus, except you should turn off your Wi-Fi when you don't need it. Do they have to do that?
No, it's a good idea. Maybe we should go to the Red River Gorge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I sat and I just looked at all of these figures, and probably I'm not the first person to have this idea, but to write something from the data. I didn't write anything with words. I had all these drafts, and I took figures out of it, and I made this new thesis starting from scratch that contained figures only. And that was my outline. I don't like writing outlines. I want at least I don't want to put Roman numeral 1 and 1A and 1B, etc. I write something by saying this figure tells this story. If I had this figure and a caption, I wouldn't have to explain it to someone who didn't know the area, but you do have to explain it in case people don't. And so I had this list of a few hundred figures, and that was my thesis, and then I finished it by writing around it. And then the last thing to go in was the introduction, which was the hardest thing to write, and I got a conditional pass on my thesis defense because my introduction was not well liked by my thesis committee, and they said that I had to rewrite it entirely, so that took another month. But I'd say that was the most difficult part, with actually connecting all these stories, and if you can identify how are your individual stories within your thesis going to connect, that makes the introduction certainly easier. And I guess that's the hardest part to write, even in some papers, because that's the part where you have to know the literature really well. So you know a lot more. There's a lot more data in the introduction that's not really there in any paper or thesis that is summarizing so much work that you have to be aware of. I think that's why it's most challenging. So those are my 2 pieces of advice. Think about the minimum publishable unit, and if you're doing a thesis that's data based, is to think about letting the data tell the story and the figures tell the story.
I try to make a distinction between my own writing as opposed to being a teacher, a mentor, an advisor, so that I try not to be completely autobiographical. But one thing that I found is that regardless of your field or discipline, and there's this incredible range as I look through, I see agricultural economics seem to be making a move in here. I was hoping there'd be some people from math. I have some great anecdotes about math dissertations. But you're somewhere in that mix between astronomy and zoology. You need an essential question, something that elicits curiosity and is significant. And I think that you should be able to write that on a 3x5 index card, inches, not feet. And you have that close at hand. And whatever you read and write and survey and circle around from Buffalo and divert to Rochester, whatever, you always ask, am I getting closer or further from this essential question? And it has to be significant, and it has to be something that elicits, if not passion, at least curiosity, something that bothers you. I don't have the threshold for pain that some people do. I think it's very difficult to write more than 3 or 4 hours a day. If you can genuinely put in 3 to 4 hours a day of writing consistently, I think that's more than enough. Beyond that, it's really counterproductive. And what I consider is going horseback riding. Or for myself, it was long distance running. I not only finished a dissertation, I set a PR in the marathon, so it was kind of a win-win situation. The other thing that I remember by chance coming across in the Harvard Guide to American History, and I think it was on page 972, and it took me a while to get there. But the author, very, very distinguished historian, Oscar Handlin, he had this wonderful advice, which I wish I had encountered years before. He said to graduate students, stop researching and start writing. He says, the odds are that you probably know more than 99% of the people, including your department, about this topic than anyone. And what you really ought to do is put more thought into telling an enjoyable story. And if you tie that to having this essential question that animates your work, I think it can reduce some of the angst and pain that's often attributed to the dissertation. It actually is pretty enjoyable. I don't think dissertations should be a magnum opus. I'd like to think if you are going to be a scholar, that you're going to have many articles, possibly many books, presentations in your career, and to be totally consumed for years and pages by your dissertation, I think is a dubious use of time and talent. So try to keep it concise. The other thing is there's a temptation to read voluminously. I would also suggest something like reading less. Read in a more discriminating way. Try to figure out what are the really essential articles or books in your field. What are you responding to? And distinguish. Why are some works very, very good? Why are some very, very bad? They may be influential but bad. And so sort out what you read rather than just read voraciously. Sometimes I'll be reading a student's draft of a dissertation, and during the PowerPoint presentation, which I now forbid for my graduate students, I flip back to the bibliography, and at random I'll select a work. And I'll ask the student, well, tell me, why did you include this work? And it has a wonderful antidote to padding. So know why you're reading something, why you're keeping it in. Tell the story, tell it well. I do think cross-training, where you incubate, some of your best ideas will come while you're not writing. So build in that into your daily and weekly and monthly schedule. Now, thank goodness, the message I really want to tell you, but it's outdated, is pagination. Because in an earlier era, before word processing, you had to use like Smith Corona typewriters. And I my dissertation, I misnumbered because I left out page 28. And I discovered that when I was typing in page 300. A lot of whiteout down the drain. So mercifully, we're beyond that.
John, I'm going to call on you to tell your anecdote about the math dissertations, because you had some historical information about the longest and the shortest that I think they'd find interesting.
That was during our writing break. But one of my rules of thumb is I always associated with graduate students in other departments. So it meant that even though I didn't get a chapter written, I learned an incredible amount about the design of zoos from a graduate student in landscape architecture, which to this day I find very helpful in understanding politics. But we had this contest to figure out if we could find the shortest and longest dissertations. And the winner, Size Matters, went to the history department. It was like 7 volumes, 150 pages. And we dubbed it the centipede because it moved on hundreds of footnotes. But the other extreme was the shortest dissertation was from mathematics. And it was 17 pages. And I swear the guy fluffed it up with his long, like thanking his aunts and uncles and whatever. And he extended his acknowledgments to like 6 pages. And he got down to the heart of the matter. One math anecdote, because there are no math machines, right? Back in the late 1980s at Stanford, there was this guy named Theodore Streletsky. He's kind of the patron saint of doctoral students. And he tried for years to get an appointment with his dissertation advisor, and in vain. And so what he did, finally, in exasperation, on a quiet Friday afternoon, he had a little sign that says, "The professor is not in." He put it on his advisor's door. He goes in and he bludgeons his professor to death. Now, I claim that he would have been exonerated by a true jury of his peers, namely other doctoral students. But they sent him to minimum security prison in San Luis Obispo, which is, has a harsh climate of 70 degrees in February. And they had one condition, was that he could not set foot back on the Stanford campus. He broke it, and he went back to the lab or to the library, whatever, so they sent him back to San Luis Obispo. So he said, well, God, this is better than having a postdoc. I get time to write, I get 3 meals a day, and one of these days I'll publish. True facts.
Last week on the panel with the recent defenders and postdocs, one of the themes that came up was the storiness of the dissertation. You have to find the arc of the story, tell the story. And we've talked some about the creative writing process. And we can't always make those comparisons. We do have at least 1 or 2 creative writers in the bunch. Some writers write with an ending in mind, knowing where they're headed. Some writers don't have any idea really at the outset where the piece may be headed. So you talked about, Mark, you talked about what's fun and what's not fun about the writing process. What's fun to me, I think, is discovering something that I didn't have any idea was there until I actually had to put my fingers on the keyboard or pen to paper. So I'm wondering if you could each speak a little bit to moments when you've made discoveries in writing where otherwise you may not have realized something.
I mean,
Because I think that's a great motivator to keep
I could
going.
say that not a single one of my initial hypotheses has ever been borne out. I mean, I just have a luck of the draw of every expectation, no matter how mundane the data, it looked, and you just want to curl up into a fetal position, when you first look at the data, because it's all wrong. It doesn't work. You see a flat regression line, or a zero or negative adjusted R-square, or something like that. And it always takes, further analysis, digging deeper, boring down to discover something. And every time I discover it, it's like, why didn't I see that initially? Because it's like the story. The story has to pop out and beat you over the head. And that's kind of a cool discovery. Sometimes, for example, I did a study comparing whites used in the criminal justice system to African Americans. And, I could get the whites, the non-Hispanic whites views, but I was a little bit slow on the African Americans. It took me longer, but it was a real honest discovery, and it made all the difference. So sometimes it's hitting the brick wall and just not giving up, strangling Mother Nature till she confesses, one of those metaphors, So, and that's really fun. And then you feel enthusiastic again and can write it out. What about when you are holed up in your carrel or cubicle and nothing pops out, and what do you do to while away your time?
Right. Well, first of all, I think writing a dissertation for me was a very enjoyable experience. It was one of the most pleasing experiences of my life. To be independent as a writer, to know that I had the story to tell. I was finding that story. The routine for me is half the fun. I mean, that's what enables you to sort of, find those other moments in your day and your week to let loose, to kind of let the stress go, and to kind of put some, to punch the clock figuratively, right? To know that when you leave that room, that the rest of the day you could spend with your family or your friends or your partner, whatever it takes. But when you're when the writing block excuse, what's interesting is I wrote down some of the key points here, and I agree with everything everybody said. It's, the chemist and the English professor are saying the same thing about letting a figure tell the story. And I think in my case, for someone in the humanities who's looking at a case study, a passage in a literary text or some data that you might have, oftentimes trying to figure out that story is letting all the words go and putting that figure at the top and saying, well, what story is this passage telling? Like, why is this interesting to me? Like, why of all the pages in this book or all the pieces of data does this appeal to me? And then I think you're right. Only one person can tell that story, and that's you. Your professor can't tell the story. The hotshot you're reading, who just published a book last month, they can't tell that story either. So I think that's the trick. I read a lot of dissertations and a lot of articles in manuscript form where a young scholar hasn't quite figured out that they need to tell the story. Yeah. You can't impress anybody with the sort of very blinkered analysis of data, because a lot of experienced scholars have seen that over and over and over. But they want to be brought into what's unique about this project, and that's the hard part, I think. So. So that's what I basically do. That I look at the figure when I get, when I start something new, and I try to figure out why this appealed to me. Of all the places I kind of circled and said, I got to come back to this. There's a reason for it. Unfortunately, writing is the only way you can, in my opinion, is the only way you can really discover that. You have to get it out of your brain and onto paper.
I think the idea of a story too is paramount, you know, and that was something that somebody who I just introduced himself, who was more senior than I and more renowned than I was, when I was just turning associate, introduced himself to me at a conference and asked me onto a project he was gearing up. And when I didn't write my first book until 5 years ago, mostly in articles. Well, all articles prior to that time. And he just kept hammering the story. You know, what's the story? What's the story? Because there's a fundamental human, you know, that's the way you connect to something on paper. There has to be a story. And there has to be a story up here before you can present it to your audience. And that's kind of the fundamental building block. And the figure too, I go on with that.
But the figure tells the story.
Yeah, right,
Right,
it should,
what are the right
should.
figures to
Right.
tell the story?
I always thought I was kind of on my own, kind of hammering at that point, right? So it's nice
Yeah.
to hear that
Yeah.
in other disciplines, that actually people are saying the same thing, because
Mhm.
right, it's interesting.
Well, there are so many different definitions, ways of looking at stories. So it might be good just to get a sense of what makes a story in your discipline. And I mean, when I think of story, I think of it has to have some sort of tension to it. It has to work toward wanting to be resolved in some way, and often it's not satisfactorily resolved, and that in a way is the mark of a good short story, right? It's not resolved. But so what are we keep using this term story, and it might be good just to help those who are engaged in this process now know what a good story is. And this, I guess, this is asking you too to talk from your perspective as a reader of a thesis and dissertation. What are you looking for? What do you really want to see? If you can generalize this way.
I think as you do your seminars and whatever, you encounter pivotal works, classic works, landmark works, is that it's one of those few times in your life when you have a lot of license to talk back. And so if you read something that's essentially presented as the major or dominant thought in some argument or field, and it doesn't strike you as right, like I can take an exception to that, or I'm not sure that that's right. That to me possibly is a good source to generate a story. Now, if you choose to kind of question some established major work or author, you had best be prepared to be informed when you counter. But if you don't have that question, if you don't have that response, in somewhat of thinking of alternative explanations or interpretations, then you're involved in information rather than interpretation. And I think that's the story. What you do is, if you have a question, but then also, I try not to use the word hypothesis. It sounds, I think, a bit uptown. What's your hunch? What's your hunch? What do you think's going on? What do you think is not being told by others that you might like to at least add to the conventional explanation?
I do use the word hypothesis, and I require my students and postdocs to tell me what their hypothesis is for every project, and emphasize that it's fine if you're wrong as long as you have some idea of, you have to tell me what you think will happen. And often we are wrong, I'd say maybe more than right, but then that becomes interesting to think about, why are we wrong? And or to look at a piece of data and think, this is, to know what you expected in the first place, and then see that, well, what you got wasn't what you expected for one case out of 6. And that one exception can lead to a chapter in a thesis, or a chapter in someone else's thesis, or a new article. And I think a story, no story can be completely told, so a good story is to answer part of the question, but also end with, and here's what I might do next, and here's what someone else could do next. but also to tell it completely. And I thought when you brought up the part about stop collecting data and start writing, I had double the amount of data at least that I needed to write a thesis, and probably could have defended a year earlier or more if I had just thought, what is minimum, what is the data that I need to tell a story. And you don't have to keep collecting data. If you start thinking about the data you have and noticing the exceptions here and there, or thinking about how to explain something, then you might not need those next experiments that your advisor wants, or that you think is the next thing to do because someone in your research group might have done something as the next step before. It doesn't mean you have to do it too, because you might notice something different and have a different story to tell. Hopefully you have a different story to tell.
Yeah, I think I would just add, it's tied pragmatically to your expertise in the field. Like, I think, from my perspective, being able to tell a believable story, right, not just any story, but a believable story to your committee, directly, is that you have a handle on the critical conversation, that you're part of, that research field that you feel like you're a part of. Once you have an expertise there and you have a grasp of it, then the next step is, I think, being able to figure out what's that story you want to tell. To me, it's a product of a writer's confidence. Some grad students are naturals at it, and some have to develop it. You have to know that you need to kind of put your vision on that dissertation. That's the story, that vision, and it's oftentimes in early drafts. That's what I tend to write, is not just what's the story, but what's your vision. It's basically you stepping out of student mode and basically taking control of your research and saying, this is the story I'm going to tell, with self-confidence. Professors who teach grad seminars are constantly writing in the margins to students that they sound too much like grad students. Right? You need to make that leap and start writing as an equal scholar. And so for me, that's part of the story is once you have a grasp of that discourse, recognizing the essential question, and then pushing back and telling that story. You don't have to joust with scholars in your field. You don't have to go head to head, right? It's just that you know what the questions are, and in the strength of your vision is sometimes enough, right? You don't need to, some disciplines, that's the way to go, but in some disciplines you don't have to do that. You just have to have a handle on what the key questions are. So I think that's I don't think you can tell a good story until you can do that. And since most of you have spent more than a year reading very long lists for your qualifying exams, you sort of already have that expertise.
I think it's time to turn it over to you for questions. I know you have some.
Yeah, I was wondering if you, since you're starting to work on your dissertation, what are the new excuses for delaying the writing process? Is it still, do more analysis, I got to collect more data, I need another case, or is it, I've got to build a classical music library,
Wish we had the internet.
I would maybe make a distinction between excuses from writing and then bona fide distractions. So I think, the music collection is
that's
just
true.
a distraction.
That's true. I mean, you need to stay healthy, you need to stay sane,
Good personal
during the
life.
process.
Yeah, we're still hoarding library books. And trying to do voluminous reading.
I mean, one difficulty is if you take qualifying exams and then start writing your dissertation, I don't know what the aftermath of qualifying exams were for you, but for me, I just plunged into a deep abyss, and never washed or shaved or came out into the light, and it took a while to get moving again, so you gotta occasionally take some time for your mental health. So it's good to have distractions, as long as those don't intrude. Any other good distractions or excuses or whatever?
Teaching?
Yeah, there you go. There you go. Yeah, that's a major distraction, and you get paid for it, and it's like you have to do it, and it's day in and day out.
You're valued for it.
You're valued for it, yes, that's right. So you get that immediate reward, and it's not like it's unimportant. So how would everyone, I don't want to say how I balance those, but what do you think? What do you guys think?
In response to like teaching, and believe me, this teaching, it follows you, one hopes, through your career as a faculty member. I try to identify finite, manageable goals. I mean, can I get the introductory paragraph or whatever? The other thing is that in a sustained writing, professional academic career, most of your writing is really very, very concise. Journal editors increasingly want shorter rather than longer manuscripts. They want less documentation. Publishers want less documentation because more footnotes drive up printing costs. And that's very, very important consideration. So if you're balancing with your teaching, and I tend to put my teaching paramount, foremost, is don't have some vague, lofty goal of what you're going to accomplish. Have a very precise, finite goal. I get a certain section of this chapter done, so that it's manageable but identifiable progress.
Well, go ahead.
I didn't teach as a grad student, so I was lucky there. But now I still struggle to balance teaching and writing, and I try, when possible, to. Every day that I teach is when I hold office hours. I try not to have office hours on any day that I don't teach, so that I can have a day every day is going to have distractions, so I try to group them together and not let students, you can't let them take more time than you're supposed to give them, or you sacrifice your writing time as well. And it's hard to say, I can't meet with you because I only have 3 office hours per week that I have to meet with you, and if I give you more than that, then my distribution of effort is not right. And you can go to these, and there are so many resources on campus that students have for many classes, and you can't feel guilty to push them to the study or for peer tutoring or the writing center if you don't have time for them.
Just like writing can be a black hole, teaching can be a black hole, and you have to keep it in perspective. If you want to get your dissertation done, you're going to have to devote less time to teaching than you might ideally. You just have to make hard choices. You want to get it done, you got to work on it, and you can't make teaching your sole purpose for getting up in the morning. That's my view. There's got to be, just like everything else, you have to limit the amount of time you're willing to commit to it. So you do have to make hard choices, and they may not be the choices that other graduate students would make or other faculty would make, but you have to make those choices. Just, you can get it done, and one course is not, let's say you could get a 4.75 rating in a course and you settle for a 4.3 or something because you've had to kind of skirt some of the responsibilities. That's not going to be the end of your life or the end of your teaching career, but you have to get the dissertation done. You just have to. That's my feeling. What do you think?
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree with everything you said.
And you'll be a better teacher once you get it done too.
Yeah, right. Because your, efficiency means better. right? Yeah,
You'll delay the burnout, right?
right.
So 10 years later, when you're burned out from teaching,
Yeah.
you'll be like, well, that's
Yeah.
because you cut some corners. But yeah,
Yeah.
you have to figure out, we talk about this in the English department quite a bit, is just figuring out how to cut corners with your teaching. I remember from grad school, a few peers of mine who, they won teaching awards as grad students, and I'm sure it was great, but they never finished. And that's sort of the catch-22 of teaching awards for grad students. We need to recognize great teaching, no doubt about it. But at the same time, if a teaching award is recognizing grad students who are devoting too much time to their teaching
Yeah.
and not enough to their research, then we're sending mixed
Yeah.
signals.
Yeah.
But it's not a perfect world, right? But you know, so it'd be great if you could win a teaching award by, you know, doing what your professors do, right? Getting their writing done and teaching, you know, with a very keen sense of time management, right? Not going overboard with things, right? We can teach effectively without doing too much. Anyway.
Yeah.
What are some corners that you've had to cut?
We need another session. I mean, it's like
We can't admit that,
right?
Yeah.
But it's a fact of academic life.
Papers get cut, or they get trimmed back, or
Office hours get
Yeah.
get pruned. Now,
Right.
you don't say, you know, yeah, you can make it an office hour by appointment, right? So next thing you know, you're going overboard and you're meeting that student, right, on a Thursday when your office hours are on Tuesday and Wednesday, and you meet that student, and what it means really, I mean, this is what it means for me in my daily life, is it means now that I have to make a special trip in, I have to leave my office, I have to leave my writing and my research, and that's 2 hours, maybe an hour out of the day, that, as you guys know from your boot camp, that's thinking time, that's writing time. So little things like that, recognizing that, you know, you do have faculty mentors in your department that can help you figure out how to manage your teaching better. Sometimes it won't be the faculty member who is overseeing the distribution of a course, right? Their job is, you know, they're hyper-focused on what the course needs to do and make sure that people do it, et cetera, right? So you gotta be a little bit cognizant of your faculty members' responsibilities, the role they play in these courses, and you know, you find your mentors who can help you with that, because each department is different.
And if you violate the time that you reserve for writing, if you keep making exceptions and cutting into that, you're just hanging yourself out to dry. I mean, you know, you're cutting off your finger for writing. You know, you're not allowing yourself to really make progress. Then it becomes kind of a cycle downward. You know, you'll just be teaching part-time as a graduate student, and some departments allow that to happen. You know, they need cheap labor, they'd like to have you around, whether you finish your dissertation or not. I mean, that's probably going too far, but
Might not be conscious, it's just sort of,
yeah,
right, that's how
yeah, we got to fill these
right.
courses, and so they like you to do that. They like you to, you know, do an excellent job, but it's not in your self-interest. You want to get you want to get the hell out of here. You know, you want to get a real job, because this is not a natural state. You know, it's psychologically, it's probably the least rewarding time of your life, I hope. You know, and when you get a real job, it's going to be way different, at least in one way. You know, you'll get the rewards for your work, and you'll feel a sense of satisfaction. But to get that job these days in a tight labor market, you got to get the dissertation done. So that's your responsibility, and no one's gonna, you know, the hounding won't be as intense or as brutal as it should be, that only you can do to yourself. So that's why it's really important, I think.
One thing I found this semester, I teach an organic chemistry class, a pretty large one, and this semester I had a lot more time because I set more boundaries with students from the beginning, and I was consistent, and And I also was very aware of their resources from the beginning of the course. I put on Blackboard, these are the hours that organic chemistry tutoring is at the study, which is almost every day. And someone might say, well, I really need your help specifically because you are so good at explaining things, and you're not the only one who's good at explaining things, and it's not true. And maybe if you're working with a course that has more than one section and more than one TA, then you can send them to the other TAs or the other professors. So I would send them to the other section over. I would say, you can't come to my office hours after class. Well, Professor Anthony has office hours on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Can you go to those? And I would actually look up their schedules on their student records to see if they were telling me the truth, because some of them don't even. They say that they can't come to your office hours, and it's not true. And and they want a special individual appointment, and you're not a tutor. At least if you're not being paid as a tutor, you can't treat yourself like a tutor. They're not paying you that level of I was thinking, you don't want to know how much I would charge for tutoring if you were paying me for that. It's a student work. And also, if you have the ability to do so, what the level of control you have over the syllabus, if you have any, you can say, like, raise the barrier a little bit to questions about grading. I mean, you don't want to make questions about grading go away, but if they're just nitpicking for a few points here and there, or the difference between an A- and an A, and you can say, well, if you have a question about this, well, actually, if you think you deserved a higher grade than you got, I'd like you to write an explanation of why you think you deserved a higher grade than you got, and staple it to the front of your assignment and turn it in within this specific time frame. And if you don't do it within a week, then you don't want to get loaded up with these at the end of the semester. So you raise that barrier a little bit, but it's still fair and requires the students to put thought into it, so they're actually learning in the process. But you're getting fewer regrade requests or complaints, and that saves you time too.
One more practical thing to add to that is, in response to your question, is what you see with a lot of experienced professors is if they teach a Tuesday, Thursday schedule, is, if they teach a class at 11 o'clock on Tuesday, that's their first class, or 9 o'clock, or however, whatever your schedule is fixed, is you prepare that morning, right? And so, you can see what, from your boot camp, what you can do with a block of time. And so if Monday night after dinner, as you come to the library and you write from 7 to 10, right? That's the time you set up with your family, and that's what you do. You don't do teaching on Monday night, right? You don't do it. If it's reading that has to get done, then maybe you can do the reading after your writing time is over. But as far as the nuts and bolts about what are you going to do on that Tuesday in class, you got grading to finish, is you do it on the day of teaching before class. What happens oftentimes is if you give yourself more time to prepare for class, you will use that time. And so by setting up this sort of...
and it doesn't get any better.
Yeah, it doesn't get any better.
There's a definite leveling off of prep time.
Yeah.
You might have all the knowledge that you could answer, really off-the-wall questions, for the next day, but it's not going to make a difference in terms of the amount of knowledge that you acquire.
One more thing is, if students email you, if you write back immediately, then they'll start expecting you to do that, and they'll write you even more, and their barrier to emailing you will be lower. So, I usually do respond to students the same day, but I try to make sure I'm waiting a few hours before I do, because if I respond within 5 minutes, I'll see that same student specifically that student will start to email me more, and email me with questions that he or she could be asking someone else.
It's like you're dealing with your parents, right? That's how you treat these emails, right?
I'd like to go back to the idea of the minimum publishable unit, which, it's going to be different in different disciplines. And in my discipline, in our department now, because we're trying to streamline the, process, the amount of time, matriculation time to get the degree, are now allowing, instead of writing a book form dissertation, a paperclip dissertation of 3 essays. And, you know, my discipline is kind of, it depends on the subfield, but in my subfield it's more article intensive, so you can write 3 articles, and, you know, they might be loosely thematically bound together, but it's not like a book, because if you're going to spend all your time writing a book and then reformat the thing and eliminate 90% of it to publish it as an article, you know, it makes no sense. So that's one of the things that you want to make sure that you do, is find out what the minimum publishable unit is in your discipline, and don't go beyond that. You know, the first advice I got from my advisor was, when I gave him my first chapter, was, you know, this is way too polished for a first draft. You don't want to be, you spent way too much time writing this. You know, give me a rough draft the next time, and, you know, spend less time, you know, on editing and so forth. So, yeah, I did. And he didn't complain. You know, so the other thing is, find out what the minimum publishable requirements are, and it may not be asking your advisor, it may be asking, you know, an assistant professor in your field what those are, because things are kind of developing and they're changing in different fields and different disciplines, and you want to be know what the minimum is. You know, we don't want you, if you're not going to publish your dissertation as a book, you know, you're kind of wasting your time and our time by putting it in that kind of format. Put it in a format that's going to result more directly in a publication. That's what's going to get you a job, or a better job, or, you know, that's what you should be doing too in writing your dissertation. Don't think about your dissertation as something separate from your research agenda. You're developing your research agenda now, and you could be sending out a chapter to a journal, you know, and learning the ropes about the publication process. So, you know, don't just think of it as something I'm going to suffer a lot for a year or 2 years, and I'm going to have this one product. Think about it as you know, the reason you're in graduate school is to learn how to do things that you can't, you know, are going to be more difficult when you're on your own. And submitting things for publication with all, you know, all your advisory committee and other people in the department around to give you good advice, that's the kind of thing that you should be doing now, you know, rather than waiting until your first job and, you know, learning it from scratch. Then it becomes a lot more difficult. You don't want to ask your colleagues, you know, they're all talking about, hey, yeah, you know, they're accomplished, you know, if you listen to them. And you may be a little more reticent to ask the colleagues at your new position how to do things that some of them learned in graduate school, writing a grant proposal or something, you know. So do these things now. It's part of the whole, you know, you don't want to get too distracted, but it's part of the whole process of having a successful career. You know, you're going to learn the things to do now that are going to be more difficult when you're out on your own. Do you guys agree with that or not?
Yeah, I mean, I was publishing papers as I was before I was writing the thesis, and well, some papers I transformed into thesis chapters, and vice versa.
Great, that's perfect. You know, that's couldn't be any better. Then you've got several things on your Vita. You know how to do it, and you learned a lot from sending it out, getting reviews, and
Yeah.
having to do revisions.
And I think, I like that idea, the minimum publishable unit, because that's exactly, we had this conversation in English and in other humanities fields where dissertations used to be, you know, people would say, oh, 5 chapters or 6 chapters. And really, if you look at modern dissertations, they don't need to be longer than 4 chapters.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
the 5th chapter you could have in your head, obviously. It could even be in your notes.
Yeah.
But that's something that you will continue writing when you get your first job. And so why not spend some of that time trying to get one of those chapters published
Yeah.
as an article? So yeah, I think that's a great idea, great way to look at it. And I think also, you made another nice point where if your professor, your director might be an old timer, right? Might have been trained in the 80s, right? Or something, you know. But go and have a conversation with that person. If they want you to write a particular type of dissertation, and you have other ideas, then you need to find a way to have that conversation. It might not go the way you want, but it might. Okay, you know, oftentimes advisors want you to write the dissertation that you feel passionate about, and so you can't take no for an answer until you've actually tried to explain yourself and explain your project. And I think that's something that we haven't talked about, is the advisory committee is important to this whole process. And so the funny anecdote about our unfortunate guy in Stanford, right, is clearly we all have, you know, people have difficult advisors. I would imagine, you know, we've all been difficult advisors for somebody. For me, I would strongly encourage you to develop that relationship with the advisor and the committee. What you see, or what I see as a DGS, is the tendency for a lot of grad students to distance themselves from their advisory committee, particularly at difficult times, maybe when they're not writing as much, maybe when they're stuck, maybe when they owe somebody a chapter. I would be very Machiavellian about it. That advisory committee provides the motivation when you feel like taking time off, right? When you feel like, you know, you're stuck, writer's block, you know. That advisory committee, the more they're invested in you, in your research, the more they're going to ask about what you're doing. You're going to be on their radar. You don't want to be off their radar, right? You want them to be asking about you, because a lot of your advisors, if they know that that work isn't coming from you, a lot of them may take a hands-off approach because they don't want to make your life more difficult, right? Sometimes it's a difficult conversation to have, to ask students for things when you know that they're stuck, or they're overwhelmed, or they just had a baby, or who knows, right? There's all sorts of things that go on. But I think that's the wrong move. It's, you know, you want to get your advisory committee invested in your success, right? And if you walk away from them, if you don't maintain a relationship, if you don't sort of keep in regular contact, you're not giving them a reason to be invested in your success. And that can be the motivation you need when you're really wondering about that 3rd chapter that's not going anywhere. The motivation might be the fact that your relationship has reached a point where your advisor feels comfortable enough to say, hey, I know you're having a tough time, but I need to see that chapter. That's where the relationship has to get to. But I don't think enough graduate students have, you know, I don't think enough of them have that relationship with their committees, from what I see, from my position.
So you've just brought up a really interesting question. I wonder if all of you would maybe speak to this idea of communication between graduate students and their advisors or committee members, and when should a graduate student, how should a graduate student navigate things that are happening in their personal lives that might be affecting their writing, and how much to say to committee members or the chair? Because I think sometimes there's a myth that committee members really only care about the work that we're producing, and that we shouldn't be too close. And I understand, I'm not saying it should turn into a confessional booth or anything, but how much, when, how often should we, if it's affecting?
Sometimes you hear about it, you'll hear, I had a graduate student who kind of dropped off the face of the earth, and it turned out he had a medical problem he didn't tell me about. And, you know, and I don't know if I completely readjusted and revised all my beliefs about this graduate student after he told me that. I still had wondered about, I mean, you know, and I really wondered why he didn't tell me to begin with. So, you know, there are things that go on and it's useful to know. And they'll probably, if they're a good advisor, they'll tell you, you got to, you know, I don't know. But I think it's always good to know important things that are affecting, it depends on the relationship with your advisor, how, you know, some people have good social skills and others don't, you know. They won't give you any advice. They may not be able to give you advice, or you wouldn't want their opinions.
I think as a graduate student and dissertation student, you certainly have a right to be very forthright. Now, what will vary is what can your advisor do? I mean, for example, if you have a health problem, an advisor cannot cure that, I don't think. But it's important that she or he knows that's the situation. The more subtle question is, what could an advisor do that would help get you through, you know, other than understanding that there's a delay? Are there some more pragmatic interventions or whatever? But certainly, I think you should not be silent. You know, you really should keep your committee, particularly your advisor, informed.
So maybe framing it in terms of, I think this thing is affecting the writing. Can we come up with a strategy together moving forward?
Yeah. Then that's something that a faculty member is appropriate and feasible to respond to. Sure.
Especially if you bring it up in advance before. You don't want to wait for an advisor to bring it up, and because then it might look like you're making an excuse, and you don't want to look like you're making an excuse.
Well, that's every graduate student's fear. Anytime we bring up something personal, it looks like an excuse.
But if you bring it up in advance, then it doesn't. It's not the same as being what's going on with you.
Okay. Okay.
Anyone else have any, or does anyone have any particularly salient concerns, fears, or not fears, but kind of anxiety about how things are going to unfold? Or I remember after exams, I had to go to the counseling center, you know, spend a few weeks over there to get figure out what my priorities were in life, and I felt so much better, and that was probably the best time that I spent in my, you know, entire career, you know, because it helped me. I went to this counselor, an older counselor, and he just seemed like the most laid-back human being on the face of the earth. He would talk about how long he would prepare a hot bath at night, you know, to really relax. And, you know, I got a lot out of, you know, my counseling sessions and what was important, you know, your relationships, and, you know, it's not, you know, and it helped me become so much more productive eventually, you know, to figure out that it wasn't my advisor wasn't the most important person in my life that I needed to please, or my work wasn't gonna love me back, you know, and none of this was gonna matter unless I had some kind of balance, you know, fundamental balance in my life about ways to be happy. So that was really important, and I'm so glad I did it, because I would have burned out. I don't know, I probably would have finished the dissertation and jumped out of a building or something. So that's kind of an important consideration about keeping your eye on the real prize, making this uppermost without it, confusing you about your most important goals.
Yeah, because you feel good about, I know this from the boot camp we ran in the English department. It's satisfying to show up, write, close the computer down, go back home, have a drink, come back the next day. That's enjoyable for me, and I think it is for a lot of people. That's what you're learning now. Right? You don't start to worry about what you're not doing when you're doing it, right? I mean, that's pretty much it. I worry when I'm not doing stuff, right? But I mean, if I have some consistency and I'm trying to keep track of my stuff, then I think it makes the whole process a lot easier. I remember when I was hired here back in 2003, the orientation for new faculty, actually this one was for junior faculty, untenured faculty members, and that's pretty much everything you're learning now and here and now and probably heard last week is exactly what I heard in my orientation for untenured faculty. I mean, it's the exact same stuff. I think there are probably reasons for that. It's the only way to sort of maintain, a satisfying research and personal life is to essentially put your shoulder to the wheel, really.
One other thing that Paul Sylvia recommends in his book, How to Write a Lot, is, if there are other dissertating students in your department, you can form kind of a group that meets once a week to just talk about it. If you know that you're going to have to talk about maybe, well, I was waiting for an inspiration, or, I'm waiting for a deadline, a big block of time, and everyone's read the book and they know that's BS, and so it helps to stay motivated and have kind of a social thing over coffee or something once a week to talk to others. They're doing the same thing you are, and they don't have a life either, and, that kind of thing. Commiseration and motivation. Right.
I have not read that book, but I've read, maybe it's a similar motivator, the War of Art, which talks about how to be creative and how artists they're not just creative because they're creative because they spend time and skill and they practice being creative. And creativity comes with practice, just like good writing comes with practice.
I once tracked down one of my favorite writers, a long time, a guy named Tom Drury. I tracked him down in Providence, Rhode Island, back in 1993. Stalked him. I really did. I stalked him, right? And I thought this guy was like, the font of inspiration, right?
Yeah.
And we sat and talked about writing, and he told me that, he went in at 8 o'clock in the morning and left at noon for lunch and came back at 1 and left at 3:30.
All right.
Right? And he had a great life, right? But that was I couldn't believe it. And then he started telling me about all these other writers who I really loved and admired, right? Did the exact same thing. And so then I went on this little kick where I read interviews with different writers and poets and, freaky people, right? Who don't obey a schedule, right? And what I learned was, they obey a schedule, right? They obey a schedule. And that to me was really eye-opening. And, so in other words, we sort of lionize and mythologize the inspiration and creativity of artists and poets and novelists, and you realize that a lot of them are, at heart, are accountants. They punch in and they punch out, and that's where the creativity comes from, right? The creativity comes from having those self-imposed barriers, right? That's when you're forced to respond and create something. So that's what artists teach us.
And some of them write standing, like Ernest Hemingway.
That's right.
I do.
You write
I
standing?
like standing.
Do you have one of those special desks?
No, it's a desk with a desk on top of it.
Yeah.
It's not an
Uh-huh.
elevator
Yeah.
desk. But I've
That's
seen
not a
it.
tool.
Thinking about getting one.
Well, we don't want you to use this discussion as an excuse.
That's right.
So we'll go ahead and end, but thank you all for your conversation.
Hey, thanks for coming.
I wish all graduate students could hear this.